January 7th, 1945. Zonhoven, Belgium. British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery is standing in front of a room full of reporters. The Battle of the Bulge is still raging across Belgium and Luxembourg. 3 weeks earlier, German forces had launched a massive surprise attack through the dense Ardennes forest. This attack struck American positions, causing confusion and chaos behind the Allied lines. Montgomery is about to hold a press conference. Reports from that time say he is in high spirits, confident, even a little cheerful. He has just been given temporary command of the American forces located north of the German breakthrough. Montgomery believes he has handled the situation brilliantly, and he is eager to share his thoughts with the press. However, what Montgomery says over the next hour will create one of the worst crises in the relationship between Britain and America during World War II. His words will infuriate American generals, lead to calls for his removal, and almost split the Allied coalition. Meanwhile, in London, Prime Minister Winston Churchill will have to act quickly, performing emergency damage control in Parliament to prevent a full-blown diplomatic disaster. To understand why Montgomery's press conference caused such a storm, we need to look at what happened during the Battle of the Bulge and how Montgomery ended up commanding American forces. On December 16, 1944, German forces launched a massive and unexpected offensive through the Ardennes forest in Belgium and Luxembourg. According to official military records, 28 German divisions attacked thinly defended American positions, creating a large bulge in the Allied lines. The attack caught the Americans completely by surprise. Some units were quickly overrun, while others fought desperately to hold their ground. The Germans advanced quickly, spreading confusion and chaos throughout the region. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, had to act immediately. In his memoir, Crusade in Europe, Eisenhower describes the crucial decisions he made during those first few days. He worked to organize defenses, coordinate reinforcements, and keep the Allied front from collapsing completely. Meanwhile, Montgomery was assigned temporary command of the American forces north of the breakthrough. Confident in his leadership, he planned to guide the press through his actions. But when he spoke, his remarks would not just report on the battle, they would claim credit for saving the Americans. This upset U.S. commanders and threatened the unity of the Allied war effort. The story that follows shows how Montgomery's press conference almost destroyed Anglo-American relations and how Churchill's intervention in Parliament helped prevent a catastrophic rupture between Britain and the United States. It is a story of tension, pride, diplomacy, and the fragile balance of an alliance under extreme pressure.
December 20th, 1944. According to official military records, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, made a very important decision that would have major consequences in the coming weeks. He decided to give Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery temporary command of all Allied forces north of the German breakthrough. This included the U.S. First Army and the U.S. Ninth Army. Eisenhower's reasoning, as he later explained in his memoir, Crusade in Europe, was practical. The German attack through the Ardennes had split the American forces, creating a dangerous gap in the front lines. Communication between General Omar Bradley's headquarters in Luxembourg and the U.S. First Army in Belgium was difficult and slow. Montgomery's headquarters, the 21st Army Group, was closer to the American First Army, which meant it could coordinate operations more effectively and respond faster to the German advance. Importantly, Eisenhower emphasized that this decision was purely tactical. It was based on geography and communications, not on any opinion about the competence of American versus British generals. The assignment was meant to be temporary, a short-term solution to a pressing battlefield problem. However, Montgomery did not see it that way. According to multiple accounts, he believed he had been given command because British leadership was needed to fix an American failure. This interpretation would later influence the way he presented himself to the press and to the world.
Over the next 2 weeks, the Allied forces worked to contain the German offensive. American soldiers fought with incredible determination, especially in key locations like Bastogne, where their bravery became legendary. The weather, which had been foggy and snowy, finally cleared, allowing Allied air power to strike German columns effectively and slow their advance. By early January 1945, the German attack had been stopped and forced to retreat. Montgomery, in his role commanding forces north of the Bulge, coordinated defensive positions and the deployment of reserves. The British Third Corps was positioned to block any German breakthrough from the north. Despite his role in organizing the defense, the battle was primarily fought by American troops. The official casualty records reflect the scale of the fight. About 80,000 American soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured, while British casualties were far smaller, around 1,400. By January 7, 1945, the crisis had mostly passed. German forces were retreating, the bulge in the Allied lines was being eliminated, and the Allies were preparing to go back on the offensive. It was at this moment, when the immediate danger was over, that Montgomery held a press conference. What he said during that conference would soon stir controversy, anger American generals, and nearly threaten the unity of the Allied coalition.
January 7, 1945, Zonhoven, Belgium. The press conference was held at Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's headquarters in Zonhoven, a small town in Belgium. This was just weeks after the Germans had launched their massive surprise offensive in the Ardennes, an attack that had created chaos in the Allied lines. According to multiple journalists who were present, Montgomery appeared relaxed, confident, and in good spirits. He seemed almost jovial, as if he had full control of the situation. The conference was carefully recorded by stenographers, and newspapers across the Allied world reported extensively on what he said. Because of this, we have detailed accounts of Montgomery's own words and how he described the battle. Montgomery began the conference by giving a clear description of the situation on the battlefield. He explained how the German attack had created a dangerous and unexpected situation. He told reporters that he had been given temporary command of the American forces north of the German breakthrough, including the U.S. 1st and 9th Armies. At one point, Montgomery paused, snorted lightly, and then went on to describe his actions. According to the official transcript and contemporary newspaper reports, he said, "As soon as I saw what was happening, I took certain steps myself to ensure that if the Germans got to the Meuse, they would certainly not get over that river." He continued, emphasizing his personal initiative. "I was thinking ahead. I was widening the area in which the enemy must deploy. Then I gave them battle." These words suggested that Montgomery believed he had personally saved the situation. He described how he had deployed British reserves and organized defensive positions to stop the German advance. In his telling, he painted a picture of himself as a commander taking decisive action at a critical moment. But then, according to the transcript, Montgomery went further. Some of the statements he made during the press conference would become extremely controversial. While earlier he had described defensive measures and coordination, now he began implying that the British leadership had played the decisive role in stopping the German offensive, rather than the American troops who had borne the brunt of the attack. It was these statements that would cause real damage. American generals and commanders who had fought courageously under tremendous pressure felt that Montgomery was taking credit for their hard work. His remarks, though perhaps intended to highlight British contributions, were widely seen as dismissing the heroism and sacrifices of the American forces. In just 1 hour, Montgomery's words would create one of the most serious crises in Anglo-American relations during World War II. Newspapers carried his quotes around the world, causing anger among U.S. military leaders and concern in the highest levels of government. Even Prime Minister Winston Churchill would have to intervene in Parliament to repair the damage and preserve Allied unity. According to journalists who were present, Montgomery spoke at length about the battle during his press conference. He described it as, "The battle has been most interesting. I think possibly one of the most interesting and tricky battles I have ever handled.
With these words, Montgomery framed the fight as if he had been the primary commander in charge, directing the entire operation. He spoke confidently, giving the impression that he had overseen every move of the battle. Montgomery went on to explain how he approached the situation. He said that the first thing he did was to get the battle area tidy, to clear up the mess. According to his own words, he then regrouped both the American and British forces, which allowed him to see the bigger picture of what was happening on the front lines. The phrase, "tidy up the mess," implied that the American forces had been in chaos before his arrival. This was deeply insulting to American commanders, who had been fighting desperately under extremely difficult conditions, often facing overwhelming odds. Even though Montgomery was praising his own organizational skills, it came across as criticizing the Americans' leadership. Montgomery did go on to praise the American soldiers, but even this backfired in how it was phrased. Reporters quoted him as saying, "The GIs make great fighting men, given the proper leadership." This statement suggested that the American soldiers themselves were fine, but their leadership had been lacking until Montgomery arrived to provide what he called proper leadership. The remark implied that without him, the battle could not have been managed effectively, which angered many American officers. Finally, Montgomery concluded his remarks by expressing admiration for the soldiers themselves. According to press reports, he said, "I have great admiration for the American soldier. I salute the brave fighting men of America. I never want to fight alongside better soldiers." While this praise may have softened the criticism slightly, it came after he had already essentially taken credit for saving an American battle through his own leadership and organizational skills. For many American officers, the damage was already done. The combination of taking credit for American efforts and implying that their leadership had been inadequate made Montgomery's press conference highly controversial and created serious tension between British and American forces. The press conference held by Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery on January 7, 1945, quickly became a public relations disaster. According to newspaper reports from the time, British papers ran headlines praising Montgomery, emphasizing that he had halted the German offensive and highlighting British leadership in the battle. In the United States, the reaction was immediate and furious. American generals, who had been fighting under terrible conditions and had suffered heavy casualties, felt insulted and outraged by Montgomery's statements. Among the most upset was General Omar Bradley, who commanded the U.S. 12th Army Group. In his memoir, A Soldier's Story, Bradley described Montgomery's statements as a personal insult and a gross distortion of the events on the battlefield. Bradley was so angry that he telephoned General Eisenhower directly. He told Eisenhower that if Montgomery was not immediately removed from command of the American forces, he would resign. This was an extraordinary threat. Bradley was one of Eisenhower's most important commanders, and his resignation could have caused a major crisis for Allied command. General George Patton, known for his fiery personality, also reacted strongly. In his diary entry on January 8th, Patton recorded his fury at Montgomery's statements. He wrote that Montgomery was attempting to steal credit for an American battle and that British forces had contributed little or nothing to the victory. The anger spread beyond the generals. American newspapers published editorials condemning Montgomery's remarks as inaccurate, insulting, and unfair to the soldiers who had fought and died in the Ardennes. The controversy quickly escalated beyond military circles. According to official records, the U.S. War Department in Washington received protests from both Congress and the public. Politicians demanded that American forces be immediately removed from British command, and there was widespread concern that the unity of the Allied forces could be in jeopardy. General Eisenhower found himself in an impossible situation. As he later explained in his memoir, he was caught between two very difficult choices. If he publicly contradicted Montgomery, he risked creating a rift with Britain, one of America's most important allies in the war. On the other hand, if he stayed silent, American commanders like Bradley and Patton would feel betrayed and could revolt against his leadership. Meanwhile, in London, Prime Minister Winston Churchill learned of the crisis within a few days. According to his chief of staff, Alan Brooks, Churchill was furious with Montgomery. He realized immediately that Montgomery's ego had created a serious threat to Anglo-American relations. Britain depended entirely on the American partnership to win the war, and Montgomery's remarks had endangered that partnership. Churchill understood that something had to be done personally and publicly. He could not allow Montgomery's words to damage the alliance that was crucial to defeating Germany. Churchill decided he would intervene himself, using his influence and authority to repair the damage and calm the tensions between Britain and America before the situation spiraled further out of control.
January 18, 1945, House of Commons, London. On January 18, 1945, Prime Minister Winston Churchill stood before the House of Commons to address a serious issue, the recent press conference held by Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery and the tensions it had caused between Britain and the United States. The crisis Montgomery's statements had created threatened the unity of the Allied forces at a critical stage of World War II, and Churchill knew he had to act decisively. According to the official parliamentary record, Churchill gave a speech that was carefully designed to repair the damage Montgomery had caused. He spoke directly about the Battle of the Bulge and emphasized the importance of Anglo-American cooperation. Churchill understood that in order to maintain trust and goodwill with the United States, he needed to clearly acknowledge the efforts and sacrifices of the American forces. Churchill began by addressing the broader situation of the battle. He said that while some had suggested that the battle was an Anglo-American effort, the reality was very different. The United States troops had done almost all the fighting and suffered almost all the losses. He compared the scale of American losses to the historic Battle of Gettysburg, saying that the number of casualties was nearly equivalent. Then he emphasized the limited British involvement. According to the records, Churchill stated that only one British Army corps had been actively engaged in the fighting, while the rest of the divisions, more than 30 in total, were American. By laying out these details, Churchill was making it very clear this was overwhelmingly an American battle, not a British one. Churchill went further, providing numbers to reinforce his point. He noted that the Americans had engaged 30 or 40 men for every one British soldier involved, and that their casualties had been 60 to 80 for every one British casualty. These figures were meant to highlight the heroism, sacrifice, and central role of American troops while minimizing any impression that the British had been the main force in the battle. Then Churchill addressed Montgomery's role carefully but pointedly. Without naming him directly, he warned that British claims of credit should not overstep the truth. He said, "Care must be taken in telling our proud tale not to claim for the British Army an undue share of what is undoubtedly the greatest American battle of the war, and will, I believe, be regarded as an ever-famous American victory." In this statement, Churchill was subtly rebuking Montgomery. He made it clear that while Montgomery had a role in the battle, British claims that exaggerated that role were unacceptable. Churchill's language was diplomatic yet firm. The victory belonged to the Americans, and British officers should not take credit for what they had not primarily achieved. Finally, Churchill praised General Dwight Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander. He said that any suggestion that Eisenhower had been overruled by British commanders or that his judgment had been questioned was completely false. Churchill emphasized that Eisenhower conducted the battle with skill, determination, and courage, and that his leadership was fully recognized and respected. This was a crucial move.
By endorsing Eisenhower and American efforts in Parliament, Churchill rebuffed any notion that British commanders had acted superior to the American Supreme Commander. At the same time, he preserved the unity of the Allied coalition at a moment when tensions between Britain and America had been dangerously high. Churchill's speech effectively diffused a potential diplomatic crisis. His careful balance of praise for American soldiers, recognition of Eisenhower's command, and subtle rebuke of Montgomery restored confidence in the alliance. The speech made it clear to both British and American audiences that while Britain remained a key partner in the war, the heroic efforts of American troops were undeniable and deserved full credit.
After delivering the main points of his speech on January 18, 1945, Prime Minister Winston Churchill concluded with a firm warning about the dangers of misinformation and arrogance in the midst of war. According to the official parliamentary record, he said, "Let no one lend himself to the chatter of mischief-makers when issues of this momentous consequence are being successfully decided by sword. I have complete confidence in General Eisenhower." Churchill's words were carefully chosen. He was emphasizing that the work being done on the battlefield by the soldiers and their commanders was far more important than any boastful claims or attempts to take undue credit. He made it clear that General Eisenhower had his full trust and support. The speech was reported widely in both British and American newspapers. Contemporary press coverage shows that Americans responded positively. Churchill's statements helped calm the diplomatic and military crisis that Montgomery's press conference had sparked. The American public, politicians, and military leaders all recognized that Churchill was giving proper credit to the U.S. forces and reaffirming the authority of Eisenhower as the supreme Allied commander. However, even with Churchill's intervention, the damage caused by Montgomery's press conference was not completely repaired. According to multiple historical accounts, many American generals never fully trusted Montgomery again after this incident. General Omar Bradley, for example, wrote in his memoir, A Soldier's Story, that Montgomery's press conference had convinced him that Montgomery was not only personally arrogant, but also a serious threat to Allied unity. He felt that Montgomery's self-promotion could have undermined cooperation at a critical moment in the war. General George Patton also recorded his feelings in his diary on January 19th, the day after Churchill's speech. He wrote, "Churchill tried to fix what Monty broke, but we won't forget." Even General Eisenhower, who always tried to maintain good relations with Montgomery and avoid public conflict, admitted in his memoir that Montgomery's press conference had been an unnecessary complication at a critical time. It had created tension when unity and focus were most needed. Even Montgomery's own supporters recognized the problem. Field Marshal Alan Brooke, Montgomery's superior and close ally, wrote in his diary on January 10, 1945, "Montgomery's press conference was a mistake. He should never have claimed so much credit." And Montgomery himself? According to his memoirs published in 1958, he insisted that his press conference had been misunderstood. He claimed that he had intended to praise American soldiers, and he believed that the controversy had been blown out of proportion by sensitive Americans. This showed that Montgomery never fully understood the extent of the damage his words had caused, or why so many people found them offensive. Historians agree that Churchill's intervention in Parliament on January 18, 1945, was essential emergency damage control. Without his speech, where he explicitly credited American forces, praised Eisenhower, and diplomatically rebuked overreaching British claims, the alliance between Britain and America might have suffered permanent damage. Churchill understood something that Montgomery apparently did not. The relationship between Britain and America was built on mutual respect. Any claims by British commanders to superior leadership over American forces could quickly poison that relationship, undermining the cooperation that was critical to winning the war. Churchill acted decisively to protect that partnership, preserving the trust and goodwill that Montgomery's ego had nearly destroyed.
The words Winston Churchill spoke in Parliament after Montgomery's controversial press conference are preserved in the official record. They show exactly how Churchill handled a potentially explosive situation. In his speech, he made it very clear that care had to be taken in telling the story of the battle. He warned that Britain should not claim an undue share of credit for what was, in fact, the greatest American battle of the war. Churchill declared that it would always be remembered as an American victory. These words were a direct rebuke of Montgomery's earlier statements, which had implied that British leadership had been crucial to saving American forces. At the same time, Churchill's speech recognized the heroism and sacrifice of the American soldiers and made an urgent attempt to repair the strained relations between Britain and the United States. Churchill went further. He highlighted the scale of American involvement with specific numbers, demonstrating the enormous contribution of U.S. troops. He said that American forces had done almost all the fighting and suffered almost all the losses. To put it in perspective, he explained that the Americans had engaged 30 or 40 men for every one British soldier, and their casualties had been 60 to 80 for every British casualty. These figures clearly demolished any British claim to having saved the Americans during the Battle of the Bulge. Historical records show that Churchill's intervention had a powerful effect. According to contemporary accounts, American anger began to subside after his speech. His words restored confidence in the alliance and reassured American commanders that their sacrifices were fully recognized. Even so, Montgomery remained a source of tension. The incident had angered many American generals so much that Eisenhower seriously considered asking for Montgomery to be removed from command. It was only through Churchill's personal intervention with Eisenhower that Montgomery was allowed to keep his position. Churchill faced a difficult choice: defend his sometimes difficult and egotistical field marshal, or prioritize the larger strategic goal of maintaining the Anglo-American alliance. Churchill chose the alliance. By speaking firmly and clearly in Parliament, Churchill threw Montgomery under the bus diplomatically, making it clear to the Americans that Britain fully recognized their role in the battle, while also preserving the overall alliance. This episode demonstrates Churchill at his best, able to assess a crisis, understand exactly what needed to be said, and deliver it in a way that solved the problem and prevented a rupture between allies. His words effectively saved the alliance that Montgomery's ego had nearly destroyed.
The press conference during the Battle of the Bulge became one of the most important moments for understanding the personalities and leadership styles of both Montgomery and Churchill. It revealed a lot about who they were and how they handled crises. Field Marshal Montgomery was a brilliant military commander who could win battles and organize troops effectively on the battlefield. But the press conference showed a clear flaw in his character. He could not resist claiming excessive credit for successes that were largely the result of American efforts. In his desire to appear decisive and heroic, Montgomery overstepped, insulting American generals and nearly creating a serious rift between Britain and the United States. On the other hand, Winston Churchill demonstrated extraordinary diplomatic skill. He understood that the situation was delicate. The unity between Britain and America was essential to winning the war, and Montgomery's statements had threatened that unity. Churchill knew exactly what needed to be done. He had to state the truth clearly, give proper credit to the American soldiers and their leaders, and correct Montgomery's exaggerations without making the situation worse. Churchill's words in Parliament did all of this. He made it unmistakably clear that the United States troops had done almost all of the fighting and suffered the vast majority of the losses. He praised General Eisenhower and highlighted the bravery of the American soldiers. At the same time, he delivered a subtle but firm rebuke to Montgomery, warning that British claims to undue credit were unacceptable. This incident showed the contrast between the two men. Montgomery excelled on the battlefield but struggled with humility and diplomacy.
Churchill, while not a battlefield commander in this instance, excelled in managing people and preserving alliances, knowing how to repair relationships that had been damaged by pride and misunderstanding. Ultimately, Churchill's intervention prevented a serious diplomatic crisis, maintained the trust and respect between Britain and the United States, and ensured that the Allied coalition remained united at a critical time in the war. It was a perfect example of how truth, clarity, and diplomacy can solve a problem that raw ego and misjudgment had created. The Battle of the Bulge press conference, therefore, was more than just a news event. It became a defining moment in understanding Montgomery's ambitious character and Churchill's extraordinary skill as a diplomat. It showed how words, carefully chosen and wisely spoken, could heal a nearly fatal rift and preserve the cooperation of allies during the most crucial months of World War II.
This video presents historical events based on documented records, including the official parliamentary record of Churchill's January 18, 1945 speech, contemporary newspaper accounts of Montgomery's press conference, memoirs from participants, and military records. All quotations are sourced from these verified historical documents. Historical interpretations may vary among historians and scholars. Viewers are encouraged to consult multiple sources when studying this period of military history.